Dr. Benjamin Tallis is director of the Democratic Strategy Initiative, a Berlin-based think tank set up to address Germany and its allies' strategic deficits and develop the strategies the democracies need to win the systemic competition against authoritarian regimes. He was formerly a senior research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, where he led the project action group Zeitenwende on the transformation of Germany's security and foreign policy, and indeed security and defense is going to be one of the big topics that we're talking about today. I'd like to welcome everybody from the audience to Silicon Curtain. If you're not subscribed, please make sure you are so you don't miss out on any of the fantastic guests that appear. And thank you to everybody who is supporting the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and the usual stuff. We have a number of projects on the go at the moment. We are, again, now we've successfully bought a bunch of drones, we are crowdsourcing for trucks again for Ukraine. So that link will be going into this video. And also, we are gathering for a forthcoming trip that I am planning as well. So if you can support, that is extremely gratefully received. All details in the description. We'll also put all the details of the Democratic Strategy Initiative and various links if you want to read up on Dr. Benjamin Tallis's report that we're going to be looking at during this episode. Welcome back.
Jonathan, great to be back with you. Always a pleasure to be on Silicon Curtain and an auspicious time to be so.
It's an extraordinary time, many ups and downs, a bit of a roller coaster. But I think the report you've written is absolutely timely, just as the US seems to be strategically not only withdrawing support, but actually leaning on the scales in the other direction against Ukrainian resilience and resistance to Russian aggression, which puts the onus on Europe. And could you describe a little bit then, what is the purpose and impact of the discussion paper that you've written, the DSI Strategic Diagnosis and Discussion Report?
Thanks very much indeed. Yes, the report is called Emerging Defense, Offset and Competitive Strategies for Europe. And it looks at the situation you've described, where Europe is dependent on an ally it can't depend on anymore, and faces a severe and urgent military but also political threat from Russia that we're not currently equipped to fully deal with or to fully counter. And so the report looks at how we can actually go about doing that, but it also provides a deeper diagnosis. And for us, diagnosis is actually the basis of strategy, following in the footsteps of people like Andrew Marshall, who was, of course, the dean of the ONA, the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, but also strategists like Richard Rumelt from the business world, who see diagnosis as being key. And our diagnosis goes deeper because we think that at the moment, what is driving European policy on this is a flawed and indeed too shallow diagnosis. Why is that? Well, more money is starting to come. That's good news, undeniably good news. But the bad news is if we spend it in the way that it looks like we might be spending it, i.e., on much more of the same, then we won't actually be able to counter the Russian threat. We won't be able to get ready in time, and we will actually entrench bad practice rather than reforming it in a way that would make us competitive in the long term, which honestly Europe needs to be, because we're now pretty much not the last bastion, but a key bastion of democracy in an increasingly authoritarian and hostile world. We are going to be in competition with those authoritarians for a long time. So what we try and do is put forward steps that Europe can take and a strategic approach that would get us ready to actually defeat Russia within 3 to 5 years or sooner if we can, but also set us up for that longer term systemic competition to position ourselves to be competitive. So to do that, we go through what are the other challenges that Europe faces, what are the problems in its defense industrial base that would stop us getting ready in time at the moment, and which make it a really bad idea to, for example, try and buy 2,000 new tanks, 3,000 new infantry fighting vehicles, or a lot of these older platforms. And we also look at how disruptive shifts in technology are influencing the conduct of warfare and constituting what we think are two overlapping revolutions in military affairs, which threaten the effectiveness of those old platforms like tanks and IFVs and so on, but actually create a huge opportunity for Europe to leapfrog ahead, to take a quantum leap in our defense and indeed get ready to face down the Russian threat, but also position ourselves for the long run.
And of course, in Britain, there is a strategic defence review ongoing. A number of well-known figures are engaged in that. Some of those figures were involved in the previous defence review. But of course, that was kicked off before, let's say, the full unreliability of the US really sort of started to manifest itself. In these processes you're talking about, is this a fundamental problem, as well as, say, the structure of NATO, in that not only US command, but US equipment, US satellite data, targeting data, intel, etc., are still a foundational element in defense strategies. We'll come to procurement of the new systems you're talking about. But first of all, I mean, there must be urgent reviews, I would have thought, into decoupling from the US and identifying areas where actually we just can't compete in the short term or fill those gaps in US input. Is that something in your paper? Is that something that is starting to be looked at by sort of governmental bodies?
Yes, it is. And I'm reliably assured by people who know that actually a lot of what we talk about in the paper that's been published is also addressed by parts of the Strategic Defense Review, or at least the discussions around it. As you rightly say, the emerging challenge here is the unreliability of the United States, the fact we now know that we cannot count on their capabilities, their enablers, but also the doctrine that they have taken the lead on, the way that NATO would go about fighting. And Europeans have actually outsourced most of that thinking to the US over the years. So this creates what looks like a real disadvantage, but actually it is also an advantage because of the fact we're not encumbered by a load of legacy thinking, and we're not, or we shouldn't be anymore, encumbered by a lot of legacy platforms. So that often makes change easier, and there are historical examples that show that. So lest anyone think this is just a sort of utopian leap into the tech future, this is actually based on a lot of work on the history of military innovation, the history of how you master rapid change and disruptive change. And the key to this, I think, is not trying to fight like the US without the US, not trying to fill those gaps that they would leave in terms of capability and enablers in the same way that they had them, because we simply won't do it in time. And the key for Europe in the short term has to be, if we can't get it in time, it's not what we need. Otherwise, we leave ourselves vulnerable to military attack, but also to the kind of political coercion that Russia absolutely loves, and which is the goal of any military, really, to win without fighting, and to win without firing a shot, subjugating Europe's democracies in this case, picking them off one by one. And of course, that was the problem that NATO was set up to solve a long time ago. But for the first time, we can't count on NATO to counter that type of threat. So this is exactly the situation we face, where a European coalition of the willing has to come up with a loose institutional structure. In the meantime, repurposing institutional functions that already exist, cobbling things together in order to get the effect of coordination that we actually need. And it's effect and function that we should be looking at, not necessarily form or not necessarily platform. And that goes for the military capabilities as well as for institutional functions as well.
And when we look at Ukraine, what seems to be working best is the use of not just emerging technologies, though there is that, but combining it with a rapid, iteration of that technology, rapid testing, relaying data back from the front. From my own personal experience, I know there's people who come from the entrepreneurial tech sector in, say, Lviv, and then they sort of join up, but they keep that communication going while they're at the front. So this is an extraordinary, iteration cycle, which would seem to be very difficult perhaps to emulate, because in Ukraine, it's this extraordinary combination between civic society, innovation, tech sector, and necessity. Those elements aren't necessarily in place. And if you try to reproduce them at a purely state level, then that perhaps doesn't capture the dynamism of what has made Ukraine resilient.
Dead right. Really, really good summary of what's going on there. And I think the key point for Europe, the rest of Europe, to learn here is we often say that military cycles of innovation and cycles of iteration are really slow, that the military is slow to adapt, slow to field, etc. But it doesn't have to be, as the Ukrainians are showing amply. When the necessity is there, you can do it much faster. Now, for obvious reasons, many Europeans don't still feel the same level of necessity as Ukrainians who are really on or close to the front line. But we should be trying to capture what speed we actually have and what urgency we actually have at our disposal. And a lot of that comes from the emerging defense technology industry. It comes from the startups. And don't confuse these people with tech bros or so on. They're really quite a different order of people who move at a speed that is an order of magnitude different to that of large defense companies and large defense organizations, the, if you like, military ministerial industrial complexes that we see. So we've got to unleash that power somehow, and getting out of the locked-in cycle of procurement preference for those defense primes who still dominate our imagination of the defense industry is crucial to this. So we have to inject more competition for a start by encouraging private capital as well as public money to go to the defense startups who are working in this almost Ukrainian speed and Ukrainian fashion, and be able to scale that up using our wider industrial base. And this is something. There was a really good report in The Economist on this a few weeks ago, which Joshi did, showing that back before the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was something like 85% of Pentagon spending went to non-purely defense companies. And now it's only about 6%, which shows that the US, for example, is not using its wider industrial base in the way that will help win the Cold War and in the way that helped win the Second World War. Famously, Ford and others producing Sherman tanks. Ford would not set up as a military company. We have to find the equivalent of that now in order to harness what is our advantage of scale, which is our massive advanced industrial capacity. And there's a super paper in foreign policy on that by Zander Tordoir, who's a member of our DSI action group and works at the Center for European Reform, showing how much of an industrial advantage actually Europe has. If we target that at the problem here and allow that to become our defense industrial base, and if we unleash the speed of startups to actually get that iteration of technology going, then we have a truly powerful combination. But in order to do that, we have to break the stranglehold of the classic defense companies who, let's be clear, they have still a very important role to play in certain of the technologies that we need and certain of the platforms and systems that we need, but they shouldn't be producing everything. And it's not really their fault, but they got into a situation after the end of the Cold War where they were really underfunded. We know European defense was grossly underfunded. So in order to stay profitable, a lot of them focused on making so-called exquisite platforms, really state-of-the-art, highly expensive new versions of old things, as Chris Brose calls them. And these had high margins, high costs, and so you could still make big profits on low unit numbers. That's not what we need now. We need high unit numbers. As we've seen, attritable mass is what is going to win, but it's also high quality mass. It's not just mass meat. And this is the beauty of that, what's called the commodification of the precision network warfare revolution. We can get that if we unleash this power.
And of course, this is the challenge, isn't it? Because a relatively cheap drone, may not be able to take out one of these exquisite machines, in week one, but by week four, you might have figured out, in terms of combat methodologies to take that platform out. So something that costs, tens of thousands, if not less, is taking out something worth tens of millions. Those ratios don't sort of stack up in any way at all. How do you get then? Because what the Ukrainians are also doing, as well as innovating, there's this extraordinary cycle of trying to drive down unit costs at the same time as pushing forward with innovation. This does not seem to be a dynamic which is natural to our Western procurement processes and indeed the defense industries, which no matter the quality of the product they're producing, they're certainly not geared up to be driving costs out of the system in the way that maybe a Silicon Valley operation would perhaps try to do.
Dead right. And again, that's why we have to bring in non-defense companies into this defense production because competition in other sectors keeps them honest in a way. And that's what the Economist report shows really, really nicely as well. And I think you're 100% right on looking at those cost imbalances between tank and tank killer. The FPV drone costing a couple of €1,000 that could potentially kill a Leopard 2, costing at last iteration €28 million. But it's not only the cost, it's the time taken. That drone takes weeks at most to produce. The tank takes 3 years to produce. And so if you start doing that math, not only in terms of the cost, but in terms of how you can replace this stuff, then you start thinking, why would we ever be using tanks on the front? Well, of course, we do need them until we come up with a suitable replacement combination of mobility, armor, and firepower to exploit gaps in the line, etc., to be able to take territory on the offensive. But it's the balance of those things that we need. And so investing a lot more now in that kind of platform that its value is uncertain for the time being doesn't really make sense. Whereas actually giving ourselves the industrial capacity to rapidly scale what become immediately promising innovations is the way to approach this. And anything that we can do to force multiply what we have should also be prioritized. And there's a lot of exciting work being done on this, again, by emerging defense technology companies. So thinking here of Helsing, for example, the German company who are producing really advanced AI-powered battle networks, as well as strike drones. They're known for that too. But also things like Arx Robotics, both German-based companies, which I know best, who sell kits that will transform legacy vehicles into AI-enabled vehicles. So you suddenly get self-driving trucks that were not self-driving before, fully integrated into battle networks that can also enhance the value of things like off-the-shelf microphones. And if you start thinking about this, this is what Raj Shah and others have been writing about, the guy who used to run the Defense Innovation Unit at the Pentagon, that Ash Carter set up. How do we get off-the-shelf cost technologies and use them for military purpose? And this is what we're starting to see these companies doing. So we can really actually maximize the value of the old kit that we have. Let's get it up to speed. Let's actually get it where it needs to be and working. But let's focus on having a light footprint, heavy firepower model that would also actually overcome our weaknesses in logistics and military mobility.
And let's turn to tactics as well, because of course, in the NATO doctrines in the Cold War, the idea was not to fight the Soviets, mass versus mass, but to use more complex combined arms techniques, which we suspected they wouldn't be able to master. And of course, I think if the Ukraine war has shown anything, or the war in Ukraine rather, is that no, they really find it difficult to master these combined arms operations. However, and you may think this is an unfair sort of analogy, it has been compared that the Ukraine war is a large Soviet army versus a small Soviet army, that the introduction of sort of drones, which has made the battlefield almost sort of transparent. It's actually sort of forced this Soviet style, highly attritional warfare. How would Europe avoid falling into that, given that we are at this point almost certainly behind the experience of both the Russians and Ukrainians in drone warfare, and probably behind in terms of technology as well?
Oh, great questions and great points. The key to mastering military innovation is combining technological breakthroughs with advances in doctrine or operational concepts, i.e., how we fight, and organization of forces and force planning. So you've hit the nail on the head that we have to get all of these things right together. I think it's also extremely important to note that indeed the Ukrainians have made a virtue of necessity by using the technologies that they have rather than the technologies they wish they had, which many NATO states still have available. And people particularly point to air power here. But before we get too confident in our own capabilities there, it was Mike Kaufman who said a while back, he said, European air forces would beat the Russian air force any day of the week, as long as they didn't have to do it next week as well, because they'd have run out of missiles by then. Um, and this is part of the point. So when we're thinking about how we maximize those advantages we have, and therefore where we target the investment that we need to make, restocking our Air Force magazines, massively producing air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles, and using the advanced fighter jets we have for suppression of enemy air defenses and it's what I call suppression of enemy air attack as well. So targeting the archer, not the arrow, if you like, to reduce our need for air defense and to take out the Russians' possibility to actually harm us. That's the kind of thing we should be focusing on with our air power. Now, in terms of full doctrinal development, it's very difficult to say at this stage because we haven't had the practice yet of integrating a lot of the new emerging technologies into realistic exercises and testing, which is again another thing that the history of military innovation points to. And I'd really draw attention to the work of the Office of Net Assessment again on this, but particularly Andrew Krapinovich, who is a truly brilliant scholar. His book Origins of Victory goes through this in four fantastic historical examples from Jackie Fisher's revolution in the Royal Navy to the development of what non-academics still, in my view, rightly call blitzkrieg. There was something that cut through like the French like a knife through butter, but don't tell it to an academic. They won't like you if you say it's blitzkrieg. The development of carrier warfare in the 30s by the United States. And then also the rollback of enemy air defenses and the offset revolution in the 70s in the US. And all of these things relied on really good exercises, really realistic training, evaluation of technologies, and so on. And that's something NATO's not been actually terribly good at. Injecting jeopardy into the exercises that we do on the eastern flank doesn't happen if you fight at 10 to 1 ratios in your favor and don't allow electronic warfare or don't allow mass use of drones. So we have to start getting realistic about that in order to work on the kind of doctrine that we will need going forward. There are lessons from Ukraine we can learn, but that won't be the full picture because, again, we are set up slightly differently.
And let's talk about industrial capacity as well, because it does seem that, I mean, Germany hasn't completely deindustrialized, but many other European countries went far further down that route, including Britain. Um, and also, we have relied on essentially, outsourcing of the most advanced electronic components, the sort of super chips that are required, many of which are produced in Taiwan. What are the challenges, no matter the ambition to develop the defense strategy you're talking about, if we also have to sort of rebuild some of these prime industries from the ground up? We'll bring Turkey into that in a minute as well, because Turkey is one of those other countries that didn't deindustrialize and which is showing some extraordinary strength, at least in its rhetoric, in support of, recognizing sovereign borders and Ukraine's integrity.
Yeah, I mean, again, terrific points. I'd re recommend everyone reads Sander Tordoir's paper on, again, Europe's industrial strength here, because if memory serves, he shows that manufacturing is still something like 16% of our GDP in Europe, and it's more in Germany, um, which is more than the US has, for example. And if you think of the potential of the US to produce military capabilities, it's not actually as high as a lot of people think it is, but it has been higher than Europe's in the recent past. If we started to put that industrial weight to work, and this is where the German issue becomes particularly salient, if we swing the world's third largest economy behind the notion of getting Europe secure, then that can make a difference. And it's no secret that Germany needs an industrial reboot as well. So while it has a very strong manufacturing base, it needs to fix it right now. And one of the ways of doing that is converting to dual use production and converting to mass defense production, which would also allow German startups and scale ups to innovate in the way that we mentioned. It provides good jobs and it will help provide the kind of economic boost that Germany's been crying out for, together with things like the infrastructure package that they've just passed. The supply chain issue is more complicated, but if you look at actually what have been the supply chain issues in recent past for the defense industry, it's been more things such as finding suitable armor for tanks, being able to produce that at scale, or producing the components that actually go into, for example, making a tank, because the order numbers have been so low. And so it's one thing if you order 18 Leopard tanks. It's another thing if some small manufacturer who made that little ceramic bit that goes between there and there, they don't want to produce 18 of those. This is not the thing. So actually the scale part is key to getting this working again properly. There are certain global supply chain choke points that we will have to seriously overcome. But it's interesting also to see companies like Donaustahl. Now, everyone's heard of Rheinmetall. You do the math and figure out that Donaustahl is slightly trolling Rheinmetall there. It's a small startup from Bavaria. Stefan Thumann, a big hello to you. A true innovator and a bulldozer for doing things in a European way. I mean, he was showing at Munich in the Munich Security Conference fully European produced semiconductors, fully European produced flight control units for drones. So the question is, how can we scale that up, and what can we do with what we have, rather than trying to worry about what we don't have? Again, it's we have to have the can-do spirit to do it, and that should then shape the decisions that shape the capabilities.
And this is a question I have to ask, although it might appear perhaps a little naive. Uh, we see the US certainly, parroting a lot of the narratives that are beneficial to the Kremlin, and there's been a lot of disquiet around that. What if this was to head to its logical conclusion, which is something that many in the media and indeed political circles just don't seem to want to acknowledge as even a possibility? And that is that not only do they demonize Zelensky and Ukraine and decide that they're not worthy of support, but they pressure anybody that continues to support Ukraine. That includes Europe, right up to the point of withdrawing support for components and maintenance of US provided equipment, right up to the point of even bricking remotely electronic systems that, may equipment that may contain those components. Now, this is, an alarmist question, perhaps, but perhaps in circumstances not entirely unreasonable to ask.
Not unreasonable at all. It's absolutely the circumstance we have to be prepared for, because you can't go into a fight not knowing whether your equipment is going to work or not, or be allowed to work. I mean, that's a truly appalling position to be in. And this I think is what has legitimately caught by surprise a lot of analysts, a lot of people. We expected the pivot to Asia to continue. We didn't expect full alignment with Moscow. And there were, of course, signs that people can point to, but I don't think it's reasonable to say this was definitely what was going to happen. Also, given experience of Trump one, where there was a lot of pressure, but there wasn't a full move to the dark side. And this is what we have to deal with now. And so even if the US comes back to the good and the light in due course, us making ourselves stronger in the meantime will make us better allies for it, for the future of the free world in future. But Europe really has to understand two key things. We have to be able to do this ourselves. And that means full on geopolitical competition across all fronts. So that also means finding alternative supply chains, alternative sources. It means competing for influence and competing for resources around the world. And we have to have the kind of analysis and assessment that allows us to understand where we can best compete, where are our strengths and their weaknesses on all fronts, where we stack up militarily, diplomatically, economically, in order to be able to play that game properly. The second thing is that Ukraine is integral to Europe's security and thus must be integral to Europe's strategy. There's a very strong case now, I think, for saying that after any ceasefire deal, which viewers of this podcast need no telling it will not be a good deal and is not really a ceasefire. Um, After any such deal, Europe should really treat Ukraine as part of its own eastern flank and understand that the best way to deter Russia is to threaten Russia and to hold Russia at risk, to make Putin think, not today, not going to have a go at them today. And this has been consistently shown that if it's so clear that one side would win a military conflict, then that's an effective deterrent to others having a go. So Ukraine being armed to the teeth and Moscow's key assets governing warfighting industry and so on held at risk through massed battlefield mid-range and long-range precision fires, and the threat of an unrelenting hail of death coming from the sky. That is the kind of thing that would hold them at bay. And we need that across the whole eastern flank, including Ukraine.
And including Ukraine seems to be logical from many points of view. Its manufacturing, engineering capability, its innovation, the vast number of people with military and military tech experience. It seems a no-brainer, as well as not just the largest army in Europe, but the largest next to the Russians battle-trained army, not over 3 years, but actually over 10 plus years, 11 years now. Is it equally illogical to preclude Britain from this military procurement architecture and process, given also the experience Britain has and the advanced capabilities inherent within British military industrial complex, and the fact we are very much involved in helping Ukraine build its military industrial infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, equally but not identically absurd. Yes, I would certainly say so. I think it's really important just to emphasize that point you made about Ukraine again, that from a military point of view, they are quite far ahead in a lot of ways than many of our militaries are in terms of having actually fought at scale. And second thing is integrating Ukrainian production into our production and partnering up to make the most of our capacity on both sides and also to help turbocharge that iteration process you talked about before makes absolute sense. But it would, at this point, as we've just been discussing, if indeed the Europeans have been abandoned by the US and have to go it alone to get together with some allies around the world, with Japan, with South Korea, Australia, Canada, etc. Um, but if we have basically to rely on ourselves, then excluding the UK from that would be a particular form of madness, and it would be extremely self-harming for all concerned. Now, talking about self-harming forms of madness, one could point to certain decisions made by the UK in recent times as well. So that, however, is no reason to make another one on the Europeans' part. I mean, two wrongs certainly don't make a right there. And as you rightly point to, the UK does have advanced capacities. It has a very good startup industry. It has very good tech and digital capabilities. It has the kind of forward-leaning mentality that many European states and many European militaries wish their whole society had as well. And the UK has missed in many fora in Europe. This is a consistent theme of many discussions I have, not only in Central Eastern Europe, but also in a lot of parts of Germany, parts in the Nordics, etc., who really wish the UK were more involved. And this does seem to have provided the perfect chance to do it. Now, the key question here comes down to value sharing in defense production. Now, if we get again away from the classic defense prime based model of this, then I think that becomes a bit easier. And I hope it is not beyond the wit of our leaders to find a way to bring both the UK and Ukraine into our integral security plan.
And given the global nature of the threat, which I think is not quite dawned on everybody yet, but which we discussed before, would it also not make sense to actually extend that sort of R&D and security architecture to other, bastions of democracy, South Korea, Japan, Canada, and have this wider sense of a democratic union with a mutual defense pact of some sort?
Yeah, I mean, neo-idealists of the world unite, right? I like what you're doing there. Absolutely. Now, of course, there'll be different degrees of integration that we go to there, but a mutual defense pact would certainly seem to make sense. The question would arise, of course, how willing are people in Central Europe to put themselves on the line for part of Western Canada or part of Eastern Japan, which they may not know well. But that's the same question that has been asked, of course, of NATO. Who's willing to die for Dagovpils in Latvia, etc. So the logic of mutual defense is there. The practicality of it would have to be thought through. And building, I would say, a solid European agreement as a pillar of that democratic world would be the priority in the short term to make sure that is there. But it should really come together with efforts to deepen the integration and cooperation we have with other democracies around the world. Because if we are in a systemic competition and it's not just a world of multipolarity where based on geography, which I'm pretty sure I don't think it is, and I know, and most of your listeners probably don't either, then we have to link that up and we have to actually play to our strengths. And one of the key strengths of democracies is their alliance with other democracies. So it's about time we started leveraging our friendships for that purpose of strength. So fully agree.
And you've talked about the risk, which is always present, not just in this defense review, but of fighting the last war. That's something, Ben Hodges and indeed other speakers on the channel have talked about extensively. So which war do you worry about the fact that we're looking at and planning for? And how do we sort of get beyond that kind of thinking? Because it takes an extraordinary amount of imagination, actually, and the willingness to embrace making mistakes to think beyond that sort of slightly safer methodology of looking at the last conflict.
It's a great point, actually, because I'm not sure there's a particular last war reference point. There's a generic, fairly diffuse, hazy idea of how we might fight, but it's a lot of it's based on the expeditionary wars of choice of the last 25 to 30 years, on the European part at least. And it was Thomas Mankin, I think, who said, wars fought for marginal interests with partial means that is not what we'd be facing in a conflict with Russia. Now, the US has been, I think, trying to refight versions of Gulf War One for quite a long time, and that got stuck in that doctrine, which is very interesting because in 1992, the Office of Net Assessment published this report on what they called the military technical revolution at the time, actually using old Soviet terminology before they started calling it the revolution in military affairs. And what that said then was that we are only at the beginning of this precision network warfare revolution, which spearheaded by stealth bombers, F-117s and so on, using precision-guided missiles for precision-guided bombs for the first time, using what were quite rudimentary but effective battle networks back then, so J-stars and things like this. The US didn't really develop too much on from that, but got stuck in it. And Chris Brose's book, The Kill Chain, is good on this, as is Krapinovich's Origins of Victory. That's what I think the US has been looking at and making new iterations of that rather than leaping forward at the same time as the Chinese and to an extent the Russians were able to develop capability and doctrine not to match US threats but to counter them. So through anti-access area denial capabilities and so on, the massing of $10 million missiles that could kill billion-dollar carriers or multi-billion-dollar US carriers, etc. So I think what the US war is there is that they're looking back at that one. The Europeans, I don't think, are looking at anything in particular, but we're still looking at some mishmash of old doctrine, which to an extent it relates to what you said before about Cold War doctrine. Trading space for time, in particular, is I think a danger that has been recognized actually, but I'm not sure has been dealt with, which is the idea that you would concede territory trade space in order to gain the time for your precision weapons to beat the mass of the Soviets. And that was when then things like Assault Breaker and the attack on the follow-on forces, the second echelon, was developed. We know because of the way the Russians fight in Ukraine that we can't afford to trade space because what happens on that space in that time would be appalling for our populations. Think of butcher, think of mass torture, mass rape, and executions. So that pushes us instead to defending forward. So how do we defend in Russian territory? That means we have to be ready to go from minute one to hit hard on their territory as hard as we can, obliterate them on the battlefield, hold their rear areas at risk, hold their key warfighting, governing, and industrial assets at risk, and simultaneously deter them from using nuclear weapons. And that, I think, has to be the challenge that we set ourselves.
And one of the things when we look at the last 3 years, it's almost like we're looking at the sort of little tip of the iceberg and thinking, Russia started assaulting Ukraine, in 2022, and that's when they really sort of, tried to take it down. Whereas in actual fact, the Russian military doctrine has informational hybrid warfare, psychological and active measures, actually plays a greater role than the kinetic component of their modern warfare mantras. And indeed, it failed because Ukraine was able to develop a certain amount of internal resilience and a certain amount of, let's almost say, like the body was creating antibodies to try and fight, this Russian informational and psychological warfare. If we're going to be cynical, one could say the US has fallen far, far faster than Ukraine has from those same information and psychological techniques. If, and it's not even a big if when Europe comes under similar assault, the kinetic part will be preceded by massive hybrid type operations, whether they're psychological, whether it's trying to take down and hack democracy, whether it's creating extremist groups, such as in the UK. And one could point at Tommy Robinson and the riots that
Mm.
almost kicked off but failed. These things, I think, are all part of that non-kinetic warfare. What are we doing to plan against that? Because it's all very well having these big, defense plans and big budgets. Are we putting serious money and thinking into countering the non-kinetic hostility from Russia?
Well, great question again. And I think when you said, massive hybrid attack would come, I think it is already coming. This is the preparing the ground, preparing the battlefield in a way. But there is actually a role for the type of stuff we were talking about before in countering that, because the Russian coercive threat comes partly from that military and conventional and nuclear imbalance they're able to show to us. And so there is a certain element of fear that they create through this that they continue to play on. This was again a tactic they used during the Cold War. It's a tactic they use now and remorselessly on Germany in particular, which is seen as the soft underbelly here. And we have seen, coming to your point, a serious failure to actually deal with almost any of the hybrid destabilization, subversion, and kinetic activities that are going on German soil, be that the arson attacks on arms manufacturers, be that the extrajudicial executions, be it the mass information warfare, which has now been hyped by Musk and others as well, and amplified by them. And we could point to examples all around Europe for this, but I still think Gabrielis Landsbergis was right when he said our leaders call these things hybrid attacks so they don't have to deal with them. And that they are attacks, plain and simple, and they are really preparing the battlefield here. Mark Galeotti, who's a guest on your show before, I know won't thank me for bringing up the Gerasimov doctrine, I'm sure, but let that be a phrase that never dies, Mark, and greetings to you. But this part notion of preparing the battlefield and of preparing that through the information space and understanding that, in fact, as part of the battle space is key to this. But I think, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, that actually the best way to address what that feeds on is to fix our own roof and to fix the cracks in our society, to make sure that our societies are properly bound in together. And because a cohesive society will be a resilient society. And for that, people have to be able to see their future in that society. So I think to give Germany credit, this is actually where the big measure that's been passed this week, don't call it a Zeitenwende, whatever you do, we're not going down that road again, I hope. But not only is it whatever it takes defense spending, after the alteration to the debt rules, there is a 500 billion euro fund, which, thanks to the intervention of the Greens, is now a lot better than it was before, to boost German infrastructure and to get Germany up to scratch in terms of meeting its climate neutrality targets and so on, in a way that provides meaningful futures for its people. So understanding these two things together as countering the threat from information warfare, countering the threat from those within, like the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, far right, Sarah Wagenknecht on the far left, who feed on that, who amplify Russian propaganda. This is a really powerful 1-2 punch on defense spending on the one hand and infrastructure and providing more credible futures on the other. And I think that's a good lesson actually to others to be able to copy.
And as education, of course, is a huge part of that because without teaching certain abilities to question information and have some sort of deeper historical context that you can only get through education, and that's difficult to win that over. Let's turn to NATO because I'm having increasing arguments with people. We've actually talked about this before. What is the importance now of having coalitions of the willing, those countries that are not just formed around common values and have common objectives, but demonstrate their alliances through taking action? We have stronger and stronger words. It's the action that clearly counts now, and it's the action that is the only thing that's a deterrence to Vladimir Putin. It seems to me that NATO, for all of its merits, is something in terms of deterrence, more of a zombie structure these days, with a lack of clarity about its ability to provide the sort of cohesion that would be required when it becomes obvious that Russia's attacks are imminent. So, what are your theories of how we move forward?
Well, of course, if you set up an organization where there is a clear first among equals and then that first among equals drops out or takes a seat on the bench for a while, to put it politely, then you're going to struggle. Now, there's a lot of very good and very smart people at NATO who have been working on a lot of the issues we've been talking about for a long time, and it's important to continue to give them the credit that they deserve for actually doing a lot of the hard yards in terms of thinking through the mechanics of our defense and deterrence, our capability needs, and so on. But also things like the NATO Innovation Fund that are helping to fund some of the startup and scale up companies I mentioned earlier. NATO Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator. These things are still going on. So I think while at the top level we can see indeed a deep malaise that is really worrying, and anyone who saw Mark Rutte's performance in Washington last week will, I think, concur with that. At the sort of mechanical level of NATO, there's still lot really going on. Longer term, you're right. It is those who do who will actually lead us on this. It's an interesting idea actually because the old political warfare concept of propaganda by the deed has been inverted here from non-state actors, small state actors, to the states who can actually take action. So who can actually lead and counter hybrid warfare, but also actually do the hard work of deterrence, because deterrence is based on resolve as well as capability, and demonstrating resolve is thus half the game. It is those who must lead us forward. And I think, thankfully, there has been a realization among many of those countries that we can no longer be hidebound by the old structures that are not delivering decision making in time, and nor can we be bound by those states within our own institutions who are actively subverting our goals. So, I mean, this worrying times for Hungary,
I was going to
Slovakia,
say Hungary, yes, about bound
yeah.
to bring that one into it. Yeah. Hungary offers a problem. We've got Serbia, although it seems the regimes are struggling a little bit with, against people power there, and Fico in Slovakia. So there are a number of sort of weak chains, as it were. And then you've got someone like Hungary, and sorry, you've got someone like Turkey, which perhaps should be pulled more into this alliance structure. And we should perhaps, I don't know your views here, because ideally we would commit to countries that absolutely hold our values. And it's clear that Turkey is not a full dictatorship, but it has elements of a sort of hybrid autocracy,
Mm.
sort of things we don't like there. There are the threats or challenges to judicial and due process and so on. But at this point in time, should we loosen the concept of who our allies are and say, okay, Turkey may not be perfect, but they are clearly very committed to the core principle of preserving sovereign borders and in a remarkably powerful position geographically vis-a-vis, Russia versus Ukraine.
Yeah, does the geo trump the politics there, I suppose, is the question. I think we're going to have to get used to it, as the fact we're in a geostrategic competition, as mentioned before, is taking the most competitive approach to those questions. And that means putting the squeeze on Hungary. It means supporting the 3B protesters in Belgrade, Bucharest, and in Budapest as well. It means taking a smarter approach to Georgia and really turning the screws using our neighborhood policy to actually affect what is in our interest, which is a change towards a more liberal, more democratic approach to government there. The Turkey question is really interesting because having studiously sought to be without encumbrance for many years, carve out a position as close to independence as you could get, I think, in the contemporary interconnected world. I think Turkey now feels rather alone. And that's an interesting thing. They've
Vulnerable,
cultivated.
perhaps a little, even,
Well,
yeah.
indeed, this is it. And so I wonder how much they would actually be willing to make a few changes and how much we might see a slight softening of some positions, which is something I think we should encourage. I think, however, we should also be realistic about saying if we're in a systemic competition, those who don't share our system are not our true friends. And that's worth persevering with. That's, of course, a neo-idealist point of view, but there is a sequencing issue to be had there of saying, actually, we think we have more in common with you than we do with Russia. For the time being, therefore, we have a relationship of mutual convenience and mutual benefit that can help keep us both safe and allow our democracies to thrive, while still insisting that actually our model is better, as I'm quite sure a lot of Turks agree with deep down as well. So the question, obviously, there are balances and trade-offs to be had there, and protecting our own democracies at home, making sure they're safe, is paramount to that. And so if that means making some accommodations with others who are not quite on that page yet, for the sake of our own safety and security, then I think it's something we should consider.
And of course, in the pecking order, if Trump actually goes after Greenland and Canada, then Turkey suddenly starts to appear somewhat reasonable and closer to our values in this very extreme space. I'm gonna come to Georgia and actually mention Belarus in a minute. That's gonna be one of my last questions. But I want to pick up on Mark Rutte because the optics of what he was doing were deeply shocking. But and this is maybe to give him a free pass, which he may not deserve. Is there a little bit of a trick going on here, which is a little bit like a sort of smoke and mirrors? You keep Trump distracted, And you make him think that, we are coercively controlled and he's on top of it. Meanwhile, we'll go off and do our thing over here and hope he doesn't notice. Is there a little bit of a trick going on here, or is that being a little, let's say, too generous to what we saw?
I mean, I admire generosity, but I think you can stretch it too far, if I'm honest. And it's not just me who would say that. I mean, Stephanie Babst, who was formerly very, very senior at NATO, has been extremely critical of what Mark Rutte has been doing. Others have been as well. And I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is Trump distracted by this? It doesn't look like it to me. It looks like they're bulldozing ahead, doing exactly what they want to do. And it provides something more of a fig leaf for them if Rutte is there doing what he's doing. I mean, at Cafe Kiev in Berlin last week, God, it seems like another week in which a decade has happened. It was only a week ago that we had Cafe Kiev. There was a lot of talk about the dire straits that NATO finds itself in, and Mark Rutte not seemingly having public control over this. He's obviously in an extremely difficult position. That's clear. But I think sort of blithely pretending none of this is happening is not really the kind of leadership that we need at this moment.
Yes, no, I'm glad you said that 'cause that was my impression, unfortunately, and I've been arguing with a lot of people about it. Just two little areas that I wanted to sort of cover off. And I say little areas, they're not little at all. You mentioned Georgia and that our approach should be more bullish. But with the cancellation of US aid, with the scrapping of Voice of America and all these instruments of soft power, it of course gives an immense advantage to, let's say, dictatorial or aspiring authoritarian regimes, such as the one in Tbilisi, which essentially is following the Moscow playbook. Should we, at this point, maybe not yet, but when we are under, let's say, direct or even kinetic attack, should we prepare to be a little more bullish? For instance, destabilization of the regimes in Belarus, Chechnya? Should we be supporting not just the propagation of our values, but actual anti-regime information operations? I'm thinking, not going out and telling lies, because that's never helpful, but actual psychological operations, funding satire, things that will actually undermine a regime, but
Mm.
which do not negate our values.
Well, I mean, the great thing about dictatorships is you don't have to lie to undermine them. They give you plenty of material to work with that's 100% true, so we can stick to our values and have a good go at them. Of course, we should be on the front foot here. We should have been doing this for years. Not only things like Radio Free Europe, but pause on that for a moment. The name, Radio Free Europe. If there is not a time when Europe could step up and take over this operation based in Prague, a lot of extremely good journalists have been working there for years. When would we do it? I mean, this is our responsibility. Radio Free Europe should be European, and it should be thinking about Radio Free World and how do we actually broadcast out to the world and make that our priority, starting with our neighborhood concentric circles. And it can be a useful tool also in how we do proper information work in our own countries. But yes, we should be destabilizing the regimes that threaten us. Absolutely. I mean, to threaten is to deter once again. And actually, if we can, we should be on the offensive. I mean, if you're constantly on the defensive and the reactive, then you're probably not going to win. In the Cold War, we weren't ashamed to conduct operations. Now, we seem to have come to the idea that actually getting our hands dirty in that way is somehow unbecoming of democratic actors. Well, that's nonsense. It confuses substance with process again, and it confuses outcome with a fixation on rules that are supposed to keep us safe, but do little of the kind. So I think we have to get honest and serious about understanding how we put pressure on our enemies. And again, this is part of the work of net assessment, of understanding where we can actually put pressure on, where we can undermine. But for that, we have to want to win and to uncover the winning mindset within us again. To remember we did win the Cold War and it was worth winning because we have the better system is at the heart of this issue. That will help us solve our problems domestically. It will help us face down our threats abroad as well.
And the last question here, in the defense review, it's mainly focused on sort of conventional, of course. So, we've touched on informational, but we haven't touched on nuclear because you've got an extraordinary alignment between sort of, or there are certainly sort of technologies that have commonality between sort of civil nuclear sort of research and energy, and of course, the weaponizable part of it. And of course, Britain has a deterrent that's been produced in the US. For a credible European defense and deterrence, should we have not just a common nuclear umbrella covering Europe and those states that do not have, their own armaments and no wish or ability to develop them, should we not also have a common European basis for the technology itself? That would include Britain as well. And that means not sourcing that technology from the US or being dependent on Rosatom or anybody else for that matter.
Yeah, I think depending on Rosatom for your nuclear weapons would probably be a tricky business to get into right now. But yes, absolutely. I mean, look, Europe needs the full nuclear triad because we face nuclear armed foes. And we have to be able to deter them from using nuclear weapons if they were to be losing a conventional war against us. And so this is part of the challenge to be able to defeat Russia and clearly able to defeat Russia conventionally while also deterring it from using nuclear weapons. And in future, to make sure that we're not pushed around by Russia, China, or other authoritarians who may threaten us. We'll leave that to people's imagination who we might be talking about. So we need a full nuclear triad of air, sea, and land based capabilities. We need them at strategic level, but also pre-strategic level, because there's rungs on the escalation ladder that we have to fill in, and we need mass non-nuclear strategic capability. And there's wonderful work on this by Fabian Hoffman, among other people, who showed that large amounts of stealthy cruise missiles, for example, could hold key assets at risk and have a similar strategic type effect. Now, for all of that, we need European cooperation. What we don't need is a European controlled deterrent. And no one wants the European Commission in long session taking these decisions, or nor the Council even. These things have to be nationally controlled, but they have to be put within a framework where there are agreed parameters of use or guidelines for use between European states for what they're there for. Sharing some of these things is really useful as well. Sharing bases, for example, for those countries who don't want to actually have the weapons themselves. They could provide bases that are usable by nuclear capable aircraft. There's a lot of work we have to do to make this an independent deterrent, but we again have to build out from what we have rather than lamenting what we don't. And the UK will have a role to play in that. It should. France will have a big role to play in that. But so does Germany, and not only in funding things, but actually in stepping up and having some of these weapons itself. And so does Poland. And other countries who wish to join in should be encouraged to do so because sharing the costs and increasing the speed of this program is all to the good.
And could Ukraine? Because, of course, chunks of the technology behind the Russian program was developed by Ukrainian engineers, of course.
Very interesting idea. Yes, I'm sure that will raise some nerves there. I mean, nothing would speed the Polish program quite so quickly as that, I'm sure. And that would in turn have an impact on the Germans. So we will probably see a new age of nuclear proliferation, which is regrettable, but at the same time, this is the world we have rather than the world we wish we had. And simply imagining that just because we don't wish to have these weapons, others wouldn't use them to threaten us is naive in the extreme. Given the new security awakening that I think is now taking place in Europe, it is entirely fitting to have that conversation with our populations. There is a serious conversation as well to be had about nuclear energy. I don't hold that much hope of that being had in Germany, but I'm very encouraged by other developments here that have been going on the side of weapons. And so I think we can move forward again, taking the actions that we can at this time to secure ourselves.
And thank you so much. It's been, as always, both thrilling and a privilege to be able to talk to you and go through the report you've published. Links to it are in the description of the video. I strongly encourage people to dip in, have a look, and there's a lot more there that we didn't get to, but I think people will, really appreciate that detail if they make the time to read it. For today, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. A real pleasure to talk to you as always. And yes, if people do read the report and have questions or want to make developments of it or send us responses to the Democratic Strategy Initiative, we'd be very happy to think about publishing those and to help continue the conversation. Because on everything from revolutions in military affairs, military innovation, to the problems of Europe's defense industrial base, these are things we have to get right, and we stand a better chance of getting it right if we try and address them together.